Welcome to another edition of the Shea Anything podcast. Doug Williams and Andy Martino back with you on a Monday. Since we last spoke, Mets lost 2 out of 3 this weekend. They were off on Thursday, lost 2 out of 3 to the Blue Jays in Buffalo. We'll get into some of the storylines of those games, but we're really going to frame this podcast around two things that Andy has written lately, and they kind of work well into what I wanted to talk about anyway, which helps. But let's start with designated Twitter, because this will get the ball rolling, and it's obviously friend of the show and a common participant in the show. John Harper tweeted this on Saturday. Inexcusable for Rosario getting picked off to end the game, but Ramos has to be smarter too. Down a run against a pitcher who's lost the plate, can't be swinging at the ball three in a 2-0 count, getting jammed inside, grounding in a double play. Mets have had way too many of these mistakes. Harp also did tweet specifically about the fact that Rosario had a red light and still got picked off. Andy, again, just to give you a report on Mets Twitter, because last week it surprised you that the Rojas conversation with Mets fans was he doesn't have a feel for the game. He doesn't necessarily he's not a good in-game manager. And you wrote today, as we kind of moved to Louis, about how you think Rojas is a keeper. Do you agree with the assessment, Harp's assessment, that the Mets have had too many of these mistakes this year?
Sure. But and once you're out of high school, that's not on the manager. I mean, Wilson Ramos is a grown-up that's been playing in this league for a long time under a lot of managers and is responsible for having a smart at bat all on his own. That's not the kind of thing you're coached on at his level of there's probably more teaching that goes on in the big leagues than there used to be at the young level, like Ahmed Rosario say a couple of years ago. But that's not something that's on the manager. I'm surprised. I mean, I don't know if it's true that Met fans don't feel like that they like Rojas' in-game management, or if it's just, I mean, we've talked about this a million times, but the ones who are happy with him are likely to keep that to themselves, not log on to Twitter and say like, oh, nice job by the manager today. That's just not what Twitter's used for. It's a way to vent your feelings of anger with the game management if you have them. So I don't know what to make of that. I just think that clearly in our years of experience covering different teams, different managers, I've never met a fan base that liked its managers' in-game moves. It's just never going to happen. There's too much to nitpick for people who watch the games closely. So I pretty much dismiss like that line of thought and just look at what he's doing. He's managing people well. He's managing the games well. He has rationale behind all his decisions. He's the anti-Callaway in the way I'm told he communicates with his players. And by the way, with his in-game decisions, Callaway was just flying by the seat of his pants a lot of times and couldn't explain himself, whereas Rojas can always explain himself. So I think it's pretty much obvious. You look at the guy, you're like, that's a guy. I'm surprised that anyone would ever disagree with me on anything, Doug, but this one in particular.
That's not surprising. I think a couple points that you made, I totally agree with. First, let me just specify, Harp did not make that connection in his tweet between, Ramos and Rosario and Luis Rojas. I did. I used it to kind of bridge the gap between getting into the specifics of that scenario and what felt like a couple blunders, and then the Rojas conversation in the column that you wrote. The Rosario point you made is so interesting because remember when he came up, they sat him down to basically teach him how to bunt, and he really did not know how to steal bases. He was a very fresh talent, which was interesting because I think the consensus was when he came up, okay, like this is our next shortstop. He's ready to be a big leaguer, and he wasn't. I mean, the skills were there, but
the talent was there. It was the skills he was working on, right?
Yeah, I think there was a knowledge of the game that he was lacking for, the stage that his talent was at. He was super young, so in that sense, it makes sense. But there were a couple things that he just really didn't know how to do and utilize his talent at the big league level. So him getting picked off, for a Met fan, that feels like a familiar feeling with Rosario, because it's like there's just been a lack of consistent progression. But anyway, let's get more into Rojas. So I think the occasional move where like he takes David Peterson out in that situation where he could probably get another inning out of him, or the Seth Lugo 3 innings thing. Occasionally he'll do something like that, take a pitcher out too early. Every manager in baseball will make a decision like that that occasionally doesn't work.
You can nitpick any manager if you look closely enough.
But other than how different he is from Mickey Callaway, other than the fact that his strengths were a lot of Callaway's weaknesses, what do you think he does so well that led you to write your column?
Well, remember that you can't really pin in-game moves on a manager for the most part in today's game. They're organizational decisions. So I don't think it's really unless things are really egregious or really amazing. But most people are somewhere in the middle, and you can't really judge them. Like I guarantee you, it's the Mets organization that says David Peterson, 90 pitches max. There's a lane of right-handed hitters coming up in the 6th inning that we want Brad Brock for. I mean, it's exactly the same way Aaron Boone would use Adam Ottavino if Jay Happ was having a good 5 innings, and I think did that exact thing at one point this weekend. It's so normal to do that kind of thing in today's game. And these aren't really manager decisions. They're collaborative decisions. So I take that off the table and talk about Rojas. He's fine. He's Boone. He's any of these guys that are sort of doing data-based managing that's organizational. I was talking to one person who knows him well. I said, I wonder if he could be like an AJ Hinch type someday. And the person said, a high-ranking baseball official said to me, he's better than AJ Hinch ever was now. That's what this baseball official was saying to me. And I mean, I don't know about that, but because I thought Hinch was very good in his day with the Astros. But the idea is that he knows how to follow the script. He's got some good instincts here and there around the script. But the in-game stuff, again, is not really what I base it on, Doug. It's just, it's a presence. It's a feel. It's the way he communicates. It's the way he's you know how smart he is and how thoughtful he is by the way that he explains the things that didn't work out and the things that did. But like the way he was able to explain the taking out Peterson thing, he said, what I just explained, he said this amount of pitches, this lane for righties, you got Brock in the bullpen. And it's not Rojas' fault that Brock couldn't find the strike zone in that particular game. It was the right – I don't want to say it's the right move. If Todd Zeal on the postgame thought it was the wrong move, he knows more about baseball than I do. I'm not going to disagree with that. I'm just going to say that it was a move with rationale behind it. It wasn't some seat-of-your-pants move, which I'm sure Todd would agree with, just disagree with the result. So there's the way that he communicates with players in my reporting. Like if he's going to sit somebody or make a difficult lineup decision or or someone's going to be taken out for defense, they're not surprised. He takes people in. He explains it to them similarly to how he explains it to the media. The data shows us this. And like he might tell Robinson Cano, look, we think you're a brilliant second baseman with a high baseball IQ, but your range has declined. So, late in games in a close game with a lead, we're gonna make a move on defense and explain it that way. And it seems to be working. Now, I'm sure there are some guys that have been upset at different times. We heard Pete Alonso kind of hinting that he wasn't happy about DHing about a week ago. But it's hard to manage this many egos at once. But I think overall, my reporting is I know that he's communicating well with them.
Yeah, I was really interested in the McNeil hit by pitch that wasn't a hit by pitch interaction between Rojas and McNeil there. And I'm sure the majority of the frustration from McNeil was about the situation and how it had been, the umpires had handled it. But there looked to be a disagreement there. And this Rojas, what I like about what I see and hear from him is that he doesn't back down. He explains his decisions, to your point. It's something that was just done by the last manager here. The lack of an explanation for a move you made and the kind of dismissive nature of it.
Oh, God, that was
and so what I said last week to you still remains true. I really think that press conferences from a manager are like the least important thing they do and also the most important thing they do. What they tell us may not be exactly what goes on behind the scenes, what Rojas is telling us. So in that case, you take it with a grain of salt. But it's so important because it's the majority of the public's perception of that job. And you're a spokesman for the organization first and foremost. You're a collaborator in terms of the in-game decisions. you're talking to assistant GMs and GMs about moves that are made in game, before games, after games. But that when you're up on the podium and on the Zoom, that is only you. No one's feeding him lines. So that's not a collaboration. That's really what a manager.
Well, I will say you are coached by PR and probably the GM on how to handle those questions for sure. So that's a collaboration too, honestly. But you're right. He has to sell it. He has to appear. It's a tough part where he has to appear honest and forthcoming while sometimes presenting an opinion that he probably doesn't actually believe, because these are, like you said, he's like spokesman for the whole organization. So, and the other thing I would add to that is that he's talking to the players who are watching it oftentimes while they're eating after the game. And that's where you can really get into some trouble by saying the wrong thing. And some guy's in there that just had a bad game, like, you know, eating his post-game meal and going, what did he just say? So we can't look, we're not in the clubhouse. I'm sure that's happened. I wish I could tell you a little bit more firsthand. So that's why I started making some calls. Like, is he losing guys with how honest and blunt he's being? And what I was told was, no, they love him. We'll see. I agree with you about the McNeil thing. That was interesting. One thing I liked about it from what we could see on TV was I liked how Rojas turned his back pretty quickly. It was like, clearly the adult. It's like, all right, you said your piece. I'm walking away from you. That's right. Kind of what a good leader does. If I'm just, I'm whining at my manager at work at a certain point, it's like, all right, dude, you done? Okay. You know,
I have more important things. There's a game going on. Let me focus on that, because that's my job. Do you think, I'm sure you addressed this in the column, do you think that the change in ownership, which there may or may not be news after this podcast comes out, we're expecting news soon. Again, we're waiting till November for approval for Steve Cohen, but it certainly sounds like all signs are pointing to him being the next owner of the Mets. And when you have the conversation about Brody, I know that gets complicated because, you know, a GM is not that far beneath an owner who might want to make a change and switch things up. Do you think a manager in this situation, do you think Rojas has a shot at becoming the manager again in a entirely different ownership regime with this franchise?
I do not know. I don't know. I don't know, and nobody knows. Don't listen to anyone who claims to have any indication, reporter-wise, about what's going to happen with Van Wagenen, what's going to happen with Rojas. I don't know. Cohen's
I guess my question isn't necessarily like, what do you know from Steve Cohen? What's Steve Cohen telling you about his thoughts on Rojas? I think the question would be, would it be normal for a new owner to come in and change a manager? Is that really would an owner get into the nitty gritty like that?
Maybe not directly. It depends how hands-on of an owner he wants to be, which it all remains to be seen. Cohen has been notably leak-free for the most part during this process. He really appears to have put a premium on not letting much get out. So that's something that there's a reason why there's a gap in our knowledge of some of these things. So an owner will care about who the manager is because, like you said, it's the person who's the face of his organization. Yeah. The typical hierarchy is for an owner, of course, to have in place a head of baseball ops that he feels good about and can trust to make the decision on the manager. And so this gets into the Brody question. It gets into, I think it's a really tough time to change GM in November of an offseason, especially an offseason when the industry is in an unprecedented time. Free agency and trades are going to look different than ever because of the pandemic economy. So to have a brand new GM, that would be an additional challenge. So I would probably, without having taken Steve Cohen's temperature on this, to be very clear, it would seem to make the most sense to keep your leadership in place from the manager to the general manager for the first offseason through the first season, and then take a breath and figure out where you're at. Work with them for a bit and evaluate, unless he's been sitting on the sidelines and made up his mind long ago about it, some of these guys. That's what we're going to find out.
Well, that's the thing. He's not just a rich guy potentially buying a team. He's a rich guy who's a huge fan of the team and definitely watching the games every night. So you just don't know. I mean, I've just been picturing the Mets fans that you talk to who want so much change or want certain things to happen in their organization. So we'll see if that's his vibe. And you make a good point too, that I was picturing for some reason an owner picking a new manager, but in reality, it's not that. It's picking someone above the manager to pick a manager.
Right.
And who knows how involved that owner potentially would be. Let's move to the 3-batter rule. A couple of interesting ones here, Andy. I wanted to talk about some guys that we really haven't talked about that much. And simple question with Seth Lugo, and we'll start with him. He's been good as a starting pitcher. But I realize we have not tackled the future here. We've been so focused on the now, and obviously that's still important. But do you think that he, moving forward, will be a starting pitcher? Has he shown enough to have this be his role moving forward?
Well, Doug, I think your question presumes that a year 2021 will dawn for mankind, which at this moment feels like a dicey proposition.
You had your very serious face on when you started making that point. I was like, I know this is going in a sarcastic direction.
You mean when I make an overly serious face? That's my tell for making.
You were like, well, Doug,
Doug,
that question. And I was like, oh, he's not going in the direction I want.
It's interesting. I have a tell. Well, okay, that's good to know. I'm going to file that away.
If the sun rises for the first day of spring training in Port St. Lucie next year, is he going in as a starter or a reliever, in your opinion?
I think it's pretty clear he should go in as a starter. He looks good. He's got the stuff. He's got the full arsenal. He's clearly comfortable in that role. He's not a back-end starter. He has better stuff than that. So if that's a guy you can slot in as your number 3 or something next year, that's more valuable than a guy you can pitch an inning or two every couple of days out of the bullpen. So to me, that's pretty cut and dry. What do you think?
I agree. He's also such a smart pitcher. And I selfishly, I like watching him throw more than 1 or 2 innings at a time. And he's got such a high pitcher IQ, all those pitches, and he's clearly obsessed with his craft. And in that way, he reminds me of some of the greats. And he's obviously hasn't reached that level yet, not in terms of his ability, just in terms of his level of experience. But I agree. I think he's a starting pitcher, and I feel much better about the Mets' chances next year if you're looking at a deGrom Lugo 1-2, just like you are now, even though there's such a big drop off, conceivably you'll get Syndergaard back. So I'm with you there. I think he's a starting pitcher. I think he's earned it. And I thought the unassisted out at third base was such a cool play.
That was a good one.
And he's a good athlete. He's fun to watch. Second one, Jacob deGrom. This is really for no purpose other than to bring up that it's probably malpractice of us not to talk about the fact that he's just insanely good again. And that each year we do these Cy Young shows, which has felt like, it's been 2 years in a row. It feels like a regular occurrence now. And we talk about, well, what will next year be like? And we talk about the challenges of repeating and how he's wired mentally and how he'll be able to handle the success he's had. And I think I'm starting to realize that the mental side of things, if he stays healthy, he's just going to be great. There's no other side to him anymore.
For the near-term future, sure. I mean, there's certainly zero indication that it's trending in any other way. You never know with pitching. I mean, Kershaw's gone in and out a little bit over the last couple of years. By the way, a weird one. I forgot who or where I got this. It was somewhere on Twitter. Did you know that Kershaw's only 3 months older than deGrom? It's just a very weird thing. Kershaw's been around since 1971, and deGrom just got here 2 years ago. Something like that. I might have those exact dates wrong.
Koufax actually handed the ball to Kershaw. It was one came right after the other.
That's what it feels like. I interviewed Clayton Kershaw. His second start was at Shea Stadium, his second career start. And it was the first time he'd ever been in New York City in his life, 2008. And he was this doofy kid. He was 19, I think, with shaggy hair. It was very nice. He later was not as nice. But at that time when he was young, he was very approachable. And it's just been so long. That was the very beginning of my career. And he's still chugging along at a high level. But he did have some down years. So you never know. Pitching's mysterious that way. But certainly there's nothing to indicate that Jacob deGrom's going anywhere but up for the next little bit of time.
Yeah, that Kershaw point that you just made might be why he's still getting better. For the record, I think that there's a correlation between how long he was a shortstop and how good of an athlete you have to be a shortstop in college to become a starting pitcher late in your career, to not have the innings on the arm that a lot of pitchers do at his age. And I do wonder, Andy, if we're going to look back. I mean, a couple fascinating eras of Mets baseball. You'll look back at Harvey and Wheeler and Matz and deGrom and Syndergaard and be like, well, what did they accomplish? But you'll also look back on deGrom. If he wins the Cy Young this year, I'm not going to presume there'll be a fourth or a fifth, but if he does, you'll be like, okay, so they had the best pitcher in the National League 3 straight years. Mm-hmm. And what did they do with that? And I'm just, and they had so much talent too. I mean, they've had position players that have been really talented. They've had all-stars and rookie of the years, and I don't know.
It's been going on for a decade. They had a batting champ in Jose Reyes, a Cy Young winner in R.A. Dickey. I mean, it goes on and on in years where the team hasn't lived up to its star in a sense. But yeah, Jacob deGrom and Mike Trout should get together and talk about how they should be winning championships, and then just cheer themselves up by counting their money, going into Scrooge McDuck dive through the safe.
If we know anything about Mets history with their best starting pitchers, he'll pitch for in 5 years he'll go to the Blue Jays and he'll throw a no-hitter. That's just what seems to happen.
For Mets fans, I wonder if he will retire as a Met. That deal takes him, I think, to 36. Speaking of that deal, we're talking about Brody and the obviously the Seattle trade people don't like, and we'll see how that plays out over time. But that contract, Jacob deGrom, $137.5 million, I think, compared to Garrett Cole's $320 when deGrom's obviously better than Cole. deGrom, if they hadn't signed deGrom when they did for that, basically half off contract, he'd be a free agent right now. That we'd be like, Jacob deGrom's last month as a Met. Can he go out with a Cy Young before the Dodgers give him, $600 million or something? And it's so that was a nice stroke by Brody to get that done. He knew as deGrom's former agent that he was willing to get that financial security at the cost of potential future earnings. Went on to win 2 Cy Youngs since he signed the contract, right? Yeah, and could have made hundreds of millions more. So good on Brody on that one.
Isn't it interesting how contracts work too? deGrom was really thrilled to sign that, get the financial security that you mentioned, and the way that greatness works in his profession means that now he knows and Brody knows that he is worth so much more, and there's no chance of revisiting it. If you're deGrom, you can't help but being frustrated by what you're saying. Hundreds of millions of dollars on the table, but that's a strategy move by Brody and a well-timed contract. And that's when you earn, Brody earned the Mets franchise millions of dollars by signing him then, or any other team. He saved them some money.
Yeah. And the only thing deGrom might be able to comfort himself by on that is that I guarantee you there's more anxiety than excitement about becoming a free agent this winter when teams aren't going to be spending very much. But I still feel like if you're Jacob deGrom, you would have found a way to do okay. Free agency, probably beyond the 138 that he earned. But he's fine. I'm sure that he pays his bills on time now and everything's fine. So it's not a sob story, but it's interesting to see how that timing worked out for the Mets. That's all.
Yeah. How many yachts can you water ski behind? I think he's okay. But I'm glad you brought that up because that's interesting. Brandon Nimmo is the third one. Another guy we really haven't talked about. Stop me if you've heard this before. The on-base percentage is good. Mm-hmm. The OPS is good. Batting average leaves something to be desired. Defense leaves a lot to be desired. Let me pitch the question this way. When I'm guessing that you were one of the many who heard from scouts and evaluators when Nimmo was in AAA that he was probably a fourth outfielder type of guy. Is he the player they thought he was? Or is he much better?
You're saying, is he actually just a fourth outfielder? That's your question?
Yes.
Well, look, it's a good question. He's got the on-base percentage that's better than that. It suggests an everyday player. But that's his one real big tool, right? I mean, he's not a center fielder. We've seen that time in and day in and day out, and then metrics recently out just reinforced that. Statistically, the worst defensive center fielder in baseball this year. He doesn't have the bat to be your ideal corner guy. So, yeah, maybe, I don't know, but I like him as your leadoff guy.
Yeah, me too.
He's not a complete player, but he's a good leadoff hitter. So, yeah, I don't know. It is what it is. Yeah, I think he's better than a fourth outfielder, but is he an everyday player on a championship caliber team? Maybe not in a perfect world.
That's why I asked. What a strange player. If he played a really good defensive second base, I'm not sure we'd be having this conversation. He'd just be the leadoff hitter, and he'd have an 850 OPS every year, and that would be that. But he plays the corner outfield spots where a good on-base percentage, I'm not sure if that's enough to give you an everyday job at left or right. And he cannot play center if this team wants to, compete for a World Series next year. So I was just curious to know if you think that, like, if you asked Sandy Alderson right now, you were like, is he who you thought he was? And he'd be like, no,
I think they thought he was better, and they were always annoyed by that. Like, he's a fourth outfielder thing. I mean, there's a little defensiveness there because he was their first number one, first round pick in Sandy's first year. They always loved him and, promoted. Although they did trade him. They literally traded him. I don't know if this is common knowledge. It may be. I lose track. But he was traded to the Reds for Jay Bruce. Done deal. And then the Reds failed his medicals, because Nimmo had a knee thing in his medicals. So they substituted. No, the deal just fell apart. That was the year they didn't get Jay Bruce. Wait a minute. There were 2 Jay Bruce trades for the Mets. One worked and one didn't. I'm sure that Sandy Alderson traded Brandon Nimmo to the Reds on one of those.
No, wait. They didn't Dilson Herrera end up going in that trade? Yeah.
Wait.
He did.
Yeah. So I believe what happened was they substituted Herrera for Nimmo in that trade. But Alderson had agreed to trade Nimmo to the Reds, is all I'm saying. 100% Reds failed him on the physical. So they liked him, but not enough to not trade him. And what kind of player is he now? I don't know. His OPS is really good. You're right. I feel a little bad saying he's maybe not an everyday player. In some ways, he really, really is. I think that's one thing about the Mets roster that kind of low key doesn't work, is that they have a lot of guys who aren't complete players. So on the one hand, you look at it on a good day and you're like, J.D. Davis, Jeff McNeil, Pete Alonso, Dom Smith, Brandon Nimmo, what a bunch of talented players. And then you look at it in another way and you're like, God, all those guys hurt you in one way or another, don't they? Except for Dom right now. But it's like Davis has got a pretty good bat, but he doesn't have a position. He really, really costs you on defense. Alonso this year is kind of the same point. McNeil, like what kind of hitter does he want to be? He could be kind of annoying sometimes. There's always like something. It's like, can you just have like a few more players that just like, here's your position. Here you can hit, and like just go play. You know what I mean? It's always square peg and round hole stuff for the Mets.
Yeah, you're so right. Square peg, round hole is a good way to put it. It's Freddie Freeman. They don't grow on trees.
Right.
So we'll see what happens in the next week or so in terms of ownership. Obviously, we'll keep our eye on the story, and if that breaks, we'll talk about it on the podcast with Keith on Thursday, or with you again next week, Andy. But again, please subscribe, rate, and review to the Shea Anything podcast wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever. It helps us if you subscribe, obviously, but also rating and review us highly if you won't mind, if that's what you think. Just do whatever you think is honest.
Do we get reviews? Are people rating and review? Are they following that advice? What do they say? Have you read them?
I think, I've read them. Some say nice things. Some say not so nice things. That like any type of review.
Well, I would like to add, when you say rate and review, don't review if you don't have anything nice to say, people. Why would you take the time out of your day to put bad energy into the world?
Because we live in a democracy.
Help us because there's some algorithmic thing that boosts things that have the more reviews?
I think any review
You know the
probably helps, but I don't think a 1-star review helps. But also, we live in a democracy, Andy. So if people don't think it's a good podcast and would like to tell the world that they don't think it's a good podcast, then they should have the ability to do so.
We live in a democracy right now. And on that, let's end.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you later this week.